A thick arm clamped around a man's neck and yanked him sideways. His feet slid across the wooden floor. The grip tightened, cutting off the air, folding him against a chest the size of a doorway. Laughter rolled through the room. Big, booming, cruel laughter. The trapped man didn't fight. He didn't claw at the arm. He just breathed out, slow and steady, and said one thing: "Squeeze harder." The laughter stopped. Because the man in the headlock was Bruce Lee, and he had already found the one place on that giant arm that mattered. Nobody in the training hall moved. 30 students watched their teacher hang in the grip of a champion who outweighed him by more than 100 pounds. What Bruce did in the next 6 seconds turned the strongest man in the room into someone begging for it to end. Stay with me on this one. Let me take you back to how that arm ended up around his neck in the first place, because it didn't happen in a fight. It happened in a training hall on an ordinary afternoon in front of people who thought they were just there to learn. The place was a small studio in Long Beach, California. The year was 1964. Bruce Lee was 23 years old, and almost nobody outside a few square miles of Southern California had ever heard his name. There were no movies yet, no fame, no legend. He was just a lean young man who taught a handful of students how to move, how to hit, and how to think while they did it. He weighed maybe 135 pounds soaking wet. If you passed him on the street, you'd never look twice. But the people who trained under him knew something the street didn't. They knew that this skinny kid could do things with his hands and his hips and his weight that made no sense. They'd felt it. They'd been on the wrong end of it. And they'd learned to stop being surprised. Here's a thing about the way Bruce taught back then. He didn't sell mystery. A lot of teachers in those days wrapped everything in secrets, in old words, in the idea that you had to follow them for 20 years before you'd understand anything. Bruce did the opposite. He explained. He showed you the why. He'd take your wrist and put your own finger on the exact spot he was talking about and say, "Feel that, that's the whole thing right there." He believed that if a technique couldn't survive being explained out loud, it probably wasn't worth much. And that honesty made his students loyal in a way that's hard to describe. They didn't just respect him, they trusted him. Now here's the thing about Bruce in those days. He had a reputation that was starting to leak out. Word travels in the martial arts world. People talk. And when people talk, other people get curious. And some of those curious people don't come to learn. They come to test. That's where Anton Volkov comes in. Volkov was a Greco-Roman wrestler, a real one. He'd competed at the highest levels of the sport in Europe, wrestled in front of crowds, won medals, broken men in the ring for a living. He was in the States on some kind of exhibition tour, going city to city, and somebody in Long Beach had connections. So one afternoon, the door of that little studio opened and in walked a mountain. I mean that. The man was enormous. Somewhere north of 6'2", thick through the chest, thick through the neck, with hands that looked like they could crush a coffee can flat. A crew cut, a jaw like a brick. He came in with 2 other men, both athletes, both grinning, and he filled the doorway the way a truck fills a garage. The students went quiet. You could feel the air change. When somebody that size walks into a room, everybody notices and everybody starts doing math in their head. Who wins if this goes wrong? And the answer, looking at Volkov, seemed pretty obvious. Bruce didn't do the math. He just walked over, wiped his hand on his shirt, and offered it. "Welcome," he said. "You're welcome to watch." Volkov shook the hand. And here's the part that told you everything about the man. He didn't let go right away. He squeezed, just a little, a test. A little pressure to see if the kid would wince. It's an old trick among big, strong men. They grip your hand and they hold it a beat too long and they watch your eyes. Bruce didn't wince. He just smiled and pulled his hand back easily, and he said, "That's a strong grip." Volkov laughed. "Strongest in Europe," he said. And the accent was thick, but the meaning was clear enough. For the next 20 minutes, Volkov watched the class. And I'll be honest with you, he didn't like what he saw. because Bruce didn't teach the way the wrestler expected. There were no big throws, no grunting contests of strength. Bruce moved his students through small, precise things: how to shift your weight, how to redirect a push, how to find a joint, a tendon, a nerve with the tip of a finger. To a man who won his living by outmuscling other men, it looked like dancing. It looked soft. It looked, frankly, like a waste of time. And you have to understand what a man like Volkov was really seeing, or rather what he wasn't. In his world, the answer to every problem was more. More weight, more grip, more leverage, more force. He had spent 20 years learning that if a hold didn't work, you did it harder. That was his whole education. So when he watched a young man solve a problem with less instead of more, with a touch instead of a crush, it didn't register as skill. It registered as trickery, as theater, as something that would fall apart the second it met a real body doing real damage. He wasn't only doubting Bruce. He was defending everything he'd built his life on. And Volkov, being the kind of man he was, didn't keep that opinion to himself. He started making comments. Low at first to his two friends in his own language, then louder in English so the room could hear. "Pretty," he said, watching Bruce demonstrate a grip escape. "Very pretty, but pretty does not win." He tapped his own chest. "This wins." He held up a fist the size of a grapefruit, and this. Bruce kept teaching. He didn't take the bait. He'd been baited before, plenty of times, by plenty of men, and he'd learned that the worst thing you can do to a man looking for a fight is refuse to give him one. But Volkov wasn't the kind to let it go. He wanted a reaction, and when he couldn't get one with words, he decided to get one with his hands. So he stepped forward off the wall he'd been leaning on, and he walked right into the middle of the class. And he said in front of everyone, "Let me show you something, Kung Fu Kid." The room froze. Every student stopped where they stood, because now it wasn't talk anymore. Now the mountain was moving. Bruce turned to face him, calm, loose. He didn't step back, and that's the moment everything really began. Volkov spread his arms wide, playing to the room, playing to his two grinning friends by the door. He was smiling the whole time, like this was all a big joke, like he was about to teach a fun little lesson to a boy who didn't know any better. "Come," Volkov said, "you show me your kung fu, and I show you real wrestling, just for fun." He held his hands out, palms open, the picture of harmless, just for fun. Now Bruce understood exactly what was happening. This was the oldest setup in the world. The friendly demonstration that isn't friendly at all. The big man offers a game, and the moment you agree, the game becomes a cage. Bruce had seen it a dozen times. He knew that if he said no, Volkov would spend the rest of his tour telling everyone that the Kung Fu instructor was too scared to touch him. And that story would follow Bruce around like a bad smell. But if he said yes, he was stepping into the grip of a man trained since childhood to trap human beings and hold them helpless. Greco-Roman wrestling is nothing but that. Upper body control, clamps and locks and pins. It's a sport designed to make a man completely powerless while another man decides what happens next. And Volkov was one of the best on the planet at it. And I want you to sit with the size of the gamble here, because the story loses something if you skip past it. Bruce wasn't a heavyweight who happened to be a little smaller than the other guy. He was giving up more than 100 pounds. That's not a disadvantage. That's a different category of human being. If Volkov got a real grip and simply decided to squeeze, there were things he could do to a neck and a spine that no amount of skill undoes in time. Bruce knew that. He knew the margin for error wasn't small. It was gone. There was no version of this where he got a second try, so Bruce waited for about half a second. And then he did something his students would talk about for the rest of their lives. He said, "All right," and he put his hands behind his back. I want you to picture that. This slim young man giving up his arms, giving up his hands, his best weapons, offering himself up to a wrestler twice his size. He clasped his own wrists behind his back and he stood there chin level and he said, "Go ahead, take your hold." The students couldn't believe it. One of them told the story years later and said he actually wanted to shout, "Don't, put your hands up. What are you doing?" Because to anyone watching, it looked like their teacher had just decided to lose. It looked like surrender. It looked like a man handing a loaded situation to the last person on earth you'd hand it to. Volkov's grin got wider. He couldn't believe his luck. The kid had just handed him everything. All the wrestler had to do now was lock him up, squeeze until he tapped or squealed, and the lesson would teach itself. He glanced at his friends. They were already laughing. This was going to be easy. He stepped in. And he wrapped that enormous arm around Bruce Lee's neck and pulled him into a headlock, exactly the way you saw at the very beginning. He clamped down. He hauled Bruce sideways, off balance, bent over at the waist, and he cranked the pressure on, slow, savoring it, letting the whole room watch the kung fu teacher dangle. The students stood there sick to their stomachs, because it looked bad. It looked like exactly what everybody feared. Their teacher folded in half, trapped, going nowhere, while a giant grinned over the top of him. Volkov looked around the room, still holding Bruce down, and he said, You see what happens. Where is your kung fu now?" And that's when Bruce, from somewhere down inside that headlock with his air half cut off, said the thing nobody expected, "Squeeze harder." Volkov blinked. Then he laughed, because why not, and he squeezed harder. He put real strength into it now, the kind that had pinned champions, the kind that could snap a smaller man's neck if it slipped. He wanted the kid to feel it. He wanted him to panic. But Bruce didn't panic, and in the middle of all that pressure, his hands, still clasped behind his back, quietly came apart. Then everything went quiet and everybody thought they knew how it would end. They were wrong. And before I tell you what really happened in those 6 seconds, do me one favor. If you're still with me and you want to see how this ends, hit that subscribe button right now. Because this is the part nobody ever forgets. Bruce's hands came apart behind his back, and here's what most of the room never even saw because it was that small and that fast. He didn't grab the arm and pull. He didn't try to outmuscle a man who outmuscled everybody. That would have been a fool's game, and Bruce didn't play fool's games. Instead, one of his hands slid up along the inside of Volkov's forearm, the soft underside, the part nobody armors, and his fingers found a specific spot. Not a random spot. A spot he had drilled 1,000 times on 1,000 afternoons, on his students, on himself, until he could find it blind in the dark, upside down, with no air in his lungs. There's a nerve that runs along the inside of the arm, deep, close to the bone. Hit it right, with the right angle and the right pressure, and the whole arm stops obeying. It doesn't matter how big the arm is. It doesn't matter how strong. Strength runs on signals, and Bruce had just cut the signal. And here's the detail that makes it beautiful. He wasn't hunting for that spot in the moment. He hadn't reached in blind and gotten lucky. The instant Volkov's arm went around his neck, Bruce already knew where his fingers were in relation to that nerve. The way you know where your own front door handle is in the dark. Volkov thought he'd captured a helpless man. What he'd actually done was hand Bruce the exact piece of anatomy Bruce had spent years learning to switch off. The headlock wasn't a trap that closed on Bruce. It was a trap that closed on Volkov, and he built it himself. At the same instant, his hip dropped. His whole center of gravity fell straight down toward the floor, and his body turned inside the lock, spinning into Volkov instead of away from him, which is the exact opposite of what a trapped man's instinct screams at him to do. Everybody pulls away. Bruce turned in, and as he turned, that pressure on the nerve rolled and dug and drove. Volkov felt his arm go strange. First, it was just a weird tingle, a numbness, like the arm had fallen asleep. Then the numbness turned to a deep, sick, electric pain that shot from his wrist to his shoulder and lit up every part of it at once. His enormous arm, the arm that had beaten grown men into submission, simply stopped working. The muscles let go. The grip fell open. And now, instead of Volkov holding Bruce, Bruce was holding Volkov, controlling that dead arm with 2 fingers and a wrist he could no longer feel. That was 3 seconds. The wrestler tried to yank free. He was still huge. He was still strong everywhere else. So he threw his weight backward to rip his arm out of Bruce's hands, a move that had freed him 100 times before. But Bruce went with him. He didn't resist the pull. He added to it. He stepped in the same direction, kept the nerve pinned, and used Volkov's own backward lunge to fold the giant's wrist up and over on itself, into a lock that turned the man's own bones against him. And think about what that means, because it's the whole philosophy in one motion. Volkov's strength didn't get beaten. It got borrowed. Every pound of force the big man threw into escaping, Bruce simply caught and aimed back at him. The harder Volkov fought, the worse it got, and there was no way for him to understand that in the moment. His entire life had taught him that more force meant more freedom. Now more force meant more pain, and his own body was betraying him, and he had no answer for it because nobody had ever shown him there was a question. Now the pain wasn't just in the forearm. It was in the wrist, the elbow, the shoulder, all of it, one screaming chain, and every ounce of it controlled by a young man who barely reached the wrestler's chin. Volkov's knees started to buckle, not because Bruce pushed him down, but because when a joint lock is done right, the only way to relieve the pain is to go where the pain sends you. And the pain was sending him to the floor. That was 5 seconds. Volkov dropped to one knee, then the other. The mountain came down, and out of that thick, proud throat came a sound the room had never expected to hear from a man like that. A gasp. Then a word. 2 words actually ground out through his teeth. Stop, please. 6 seconds. That's all it took. 6 seconds from the moment Bruce's hands came apart to the moment the strongest man in the room was kneeling on the wooden floor, one arm twisted up behind him, begging a 135-pound instructor to let go. And Bruce let go, right away. The instant he heard please, he released the lock, stepped back, and gave the man room. He didn't hold it a beat longer to make a point. He didn't grind it in the way Volkov had ground the headlock in. He just let go, and he stood there, hands loose at his sides, breathing normally like nothing at all had happened. The room was dead silent. 30 students, 2 visiting athletes by the door, and not one of them made a sound. You could have heard a pin drop from across the street. Nobody had ever seen anything like it. Half of them weren't even sure what they'd seen, because it had happened so fast and so small that if you blinked at the wrong moment, you missed the whole thing. 1 second the wrestler was on top. Next second the wrestler was on his knees. In between was a blur. Volkov stayed down for a moment, cradling his arm against his chest, flexing the fingers, trying to convince the muscles to come back online. The numbness was already fading, but the shock of it wasn't. He'd never felt anything like that. In all his years of wrestling against all those strong men, nobody had ever taken his arm away from him, turned it off like a switch, made it useless with the touch of 2 fingers. He looked up at Bruce, and his face wasn't angry. That's the thing people always get wrong when they picture a moment like this. They imagine the beaten man getting furious, coming back swinging, refusing to accept it. But that's not what happened, and it's not what usually happens with real fighters. Because a real fighter knows the difference between an accident and a lesson. And Volkov knew, deep in his gut, that what had just happened to him was no accident. His 2 friends by the door weren't grinning anymore. One of them had gone pale. The other was just staring, mouth slightly open, at the young instructor who was already turning back toward his students like it was time to get back to work. Volkov got to his feet slowly. He was a big man, and getting up took a second, and the whole time nobody helped him and nobody spoke. When he was standing again, he rolled his shoulder, tested the arm one more time, and then he did the last thing anyone in that room expected. He started to smile, not the cruel smile from before, a different one, a real one. Then he began to laugh, but it was a completely different laugh than the one he'd walked in with. This one had no meanness in it at all. It was the laugh of a man who'd just been shown something true, something he'd spent his whole life not knowing, and who was honest enough to find it funny instead of shameful. He pointed at his own arm, then at Bruce, and he said in that thick accent, "What did you do?" Not angry, amazed. "What did you do to my arm?" And Bruce, instead of gloating, instead of saying "I told you so," just walked back over to him, calm as anything. And he took the wrestler's massive forearm gently in both hands, turned it over and pressed one finger against a spot near the inside of the wrist. "Here," he said. "There's a nerve here." He pressed a little and Volkov flinched, felt the echo of that same strange electricity. "You are very strong," Bruce said. "Stronger than me everywhere. But strength has to travel through the body to work, and the road it travels on is very thin." He tapped the spot again. "If I close the road, the strength cannot arrive. It doesn't matter how much of it you have." Volkov stared at his own arm like he'd never seen it before. I want you to understand how rare that moment was. A man like Volkov, a champion, a giant, someone who had built his entire identity on being the strongest man in every room he entered, had just been dropped to his knees in front of a crowd, in a matter of seconds, by someone half his size. 99 men out of 100 would have walked out of that room burning with humiliation, telling themselves a story about how it was a trick, how it wasn't fair, how it would never happen in a real match. That's what pride does. It protects itself with excuses. But Volkov didn't reach for an excuse. And the reason he didn't is the real heart of this whole story. Because the greatest athletes, the truly great ones, aren't great because they never lose. They're great because they know how to lose. They know how to stand in front of something that just beat them and say, "Teach me that. Show me how." Volkov had won 100 matches by being unbeatable, and in 6 seconds this young stranger had shown him that unbeatable was a lie he'd been telling himself. And instead of hating Bruce for it, he wanted to learn. So he asked, right there in front of everyone, he said, "Will you show me this nerve, this turning?" He gestured at the whole thing, the drop, the twist, the impossible escape. "Will you teach me how a small man does this?" And Bruce said yes. They stayed after class that day, long after the other students had drifted out into the California evening, still buzzing about what they'd witnessed. The two of them, the mountain and the reed, working slowly through the mechanics of it. Bruce showing Volkov where the nerve lived, how the angle mattered more than the force, how 100 pounds of pressure in the wrong spot did nothing, but a fraction of that in the right spot could fold a champion. Volkov, for all his size, turned out to be a careful student. He listened. He tried. He got it wrong and he tried again, and he laughed at himself when his big fingers couldn't find the small target. At one point, Volkov asked Bruce how long it had taken him to learn to do that. And Bruce told him the truth. "Years," he said, "every day, on my students, on myself. Thousands of times until my hands know it better than my mind does." He held up his own hands and looked at them. "When the moment comes," he said, "there is no time to think. If you have to think, you have already lost. So you make the body know it so the mind doesn't have to." That's the thing about what happened in that headlock. It looked like magic. It looked like the kid got lucky or knew a trick or caught the big man off guard. But there was no luck in it. There was no trick. There were only years of unglamorous, repeated, boring practice, done alone and in small rooms, so that when a mountain wrapped its arm around his neck and squeezed, his body already knew the answer before his mind could even ask the question. Volkov left Long Beach a few days later to continue his tour. But before he went, he came back to the studio one more time. He brought a gift, a small carved thing from his own country, and he gave it to Bruce with both hands and a short bow that must have felt strange to a man built like him. He said he would remember this. He said that in all his years, no one had taught him more in 6 seconds than Bruce had. And then he said something that stuck with everyone who heard it. He said, "At home they call me the strongest," and I believed it. Now I know there is a thing stronger than strong. He tapped the side of his own head. It is knowing. Then he tapped his chest over the heart, and it is this: not to waste. You never waste one movement. Every one, it means something. He'd noticed. Even in those 6 seconds flat on his knees, the wrestler had noticed the one quality that defined Bruce Lee above everything else. He never wasted motion. Not one twitch, not 1 inch. Everything he did went straight to the point, and nothing extra came along for the ride. Volkov had spent his life spending energy the way a rich man spends money, big and loud and everywhere. And he just met a man who spent it like a surgeon, one precise cut, nothing wasted, and got more done with 135 pounds than Volkov could with 240. The students who were there that day carried the story with them for the rest of their lives. Years later, when Bruce Lee's name was on movie posters all over the world, when he was a legend and a myth and a face everyone recognized, those men would sometimes tell people, "I was there once," when an Olympic-level wrestler put him in a headlock as a joke. And people would lean in and ask what happened. And they'd say, 6 seconds. That's all. 6 seconds, and the biggest man I ever saw was on his knees asking him to stop. And Bruce let go the second he asked. That's the part I always remember. He let go the second the man asked. Because that's the other half of who Bruce Lee was, and it's the half that people forget when they only see the movies and the flying kicks. He could have held that lock. He could have humiliated Volkov, made him scream, made him cry in front of the room, paid him back for all the mocking and the Kung Fu Kid nonsense. Nobody would have blamed him. Volkov had it coming, but Bruce let go, instantly. Because for him, the whole point was never to hurt the man. The point was to show him something. And the moment Volkov saw it, the moment the pleas came out of him, there was nothing left to prove and no reason to cause one more second of pain. Bruce had all the power in that room, complete control over a helpless man, and he used exactly as much of it as the lesson required and not one drop more. That's what real mastery looks like. Not the ability to destroy. The choice not to when you easily could. And think back to how the whole thing started. A big man walked into a small room, so sure of what he was, so certain that size was the same as strength and strength was the same as winning. He looked at a slender young teacher and he saw someone weak, someone soft, someone to laugh at. He wrapped his arm around that man's neck expecting to prove a point. He proved one, all right, just not the one he came to prove. He learned that the biggest thing in the room isn't always the strongest. That strength travels on thin roads and any road can be closed. That a man who never wastes a single motion can beat a man who wastes them all, no matter the size difference. And most of all, he learned that the person who truly controls a situation is often the one standing perfectly calm in the center of it, breathing slow, hands relaxed, asking you to squeeze harder. Bruce Lee went on to become the most famous martial artist who ever lived. He changed the way the whole world thinks about fighting, about the body, about what a human being is capable of. And he did it not by being the biggest or the strongest, but by being the most precise, the most disciplined, the most awake. Everything he became was already there in that little Long Beach studio in the summer of 1964, in 6 seconds, in the space of a single breath. An arm clamped around his neck as a joke, and by the time that arm let go, the man who'd thrown it was kneeling on the floor, looking up in wonder and asking to be taught. That's the whole story. That's who he was. Squeeze harder, he said. And the strongest man in the room found out exactly what those 2 words meant. The rewritten story runs 5,012 words. inside the 4-800-5-200 target. The 150-word hook and the final passage are unchanged, and the structure and rules are preserved. The added length comes from deepening the middle beats, Bruce's teaching philosophy in the setup, Volkov's inner worldview and why he dismissed what he saw, the stakes of the size gap at the decision point, the student's reaction to the surrender, and in the payoff, the borrowed strength mechanic that turns the wrestler's own force against him.